urgent launch of Tomahawks. Moscow is within the strike zone. Trump went off the rails after the negotiations. The Pentagon has given the green light. Ukraine is receiving the incredible. The Ukrainian armed forces have a decisive trump card in their hands. The Kremlin panicked after what they heard. The latest reports from Lukashenko. Meeting with Tikhanovskaya, Zelenskyy launches a plan to overthrow the dictator. Urgent. Lukashenko's time is up. The death sentence for the Batka has been signed. Secret agreements. This shocked the internet. It happened. Europe's patience has run out. A new super alliance. Trump was simply thrown overboard. Kyiv is becoming Europe's main iron fist instead of the Americans. A historic turning point that will forever change the map of the world. Fiery boomerang. The oil heart of the Russian Federation is in ashes. Retribution for the Russians came instantly. The occupiers' rear has turned into a blazing hell. All this and more in our upcoming report. Hotspot. Shock. Washington is preparing a deadly surprise for Putin. The Pentagon has given the green light. Tomahawks aimed at Moscow. This happened right after the negotiations. Here's what was actually agreed upon. Kyiv will get a real weapon of retribution. A hard knockout from Trump. All the details coming up.
Tomahawks for the armed forces of Ukraine in the US. A new strategy to pressure the Kremlin. In Washington, they are discussing a plan to strike deep into Russia in order to force Putin to make peace.
Honestly, I really doubt that I will be able to add anything new here.
A small group of Ukraine's supporters in Washington claims that the only way to make the Russian dictator sit down at the negotiating table is to significantly strengthen Kyiv's position, and this can be done with Tomahawk missiles.
As last year's experience showed, as soon as the United States even mentioned Tomahawk missiles, Putin immediately began to display the highest level of constructiveness, or rather tried to show constructiveness in every possible way and to demonstrate that he wants peace. As soon as Putin realized that there would be no Tomahawk missiles for Ukraine, that was it. After that, the campaign to destroy Ukraine's energy infrastructure and the terrorism against Ukrainian cities began.
At the center of this initiative is Dan Rice, president of the American University in Kyiv and former special advisor to the commander-in-chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, who held a meeting with the US Secretary of Defense, according to Kyiv Post.
Putin only responds to strength. If he does not agree to peace, then in my opinion, there is a high likelihood that President Trump will approve the use of Tomahawks.
Rice refused to disclose the details of the meeting, calling most of the conversation confidential. However, he did reveal what exactly he proposed. According to him, he directly asked the Secretary of Defense to provide Ukraine with Tomahawks, even if it was a small undisclosed number.
Even if we are given 20, 30 or 50 missiles, it won't make much of a difference. We need hundreds of missiles per month to have at least some kind of parity with the Russian Federation. And now for the latest figures. The Russians launch per month. In Ukraine, there are about 300 different missiles. We need to launch at least as many, preferably more. Only then can we really put pressure on the Russian Federation.
Ukraine tried to obtain these missiles from the US even during Biden's term. But up to this point, Tomahawks have still not been adopted by the Ukrainian army.
It is believed, again, we don't know for sure, but rumor has it, online sources say that the United States of America can produce about 100 missiles per year. 100 missiles per year. That is, for the average person, it might seem, well, 100, that sounds like a lot, right? 100 missiles, that's a lot. But let's look at it from another angle. The cost of each missile, according to various estimates, could be $2 million per missile or $4 million, as for example, when the Americans sold them to Japan at one time. So for themselves, it's a little over 2 million, but for the Japanese, it's 4.25 million per missile. In other words, these are large sums. It would seem that if money isn't the issue, then the problem lies in the quantity.
Therefore, whether Trump will approve the supply of Tomahawks remains an open question. While some officials believe that American missiles could indeed become a lever of influence on Russia during negotiations, others fear that the transfer of Tomahawks, on the contrary, will undermine diplomatic efforts.
If the United States had clearly stated that in the event Russia destroys Ukraine's energy infrastructure, Ukraine would receive Tomahawk missiles, I guarantee that nothing like what is happening now would have occurred. But the United States has a different approach. They are trying to persuade Putin in a friendly way to maintain good relations with him, and everything is along those lines. Therefore, to be honest, I don't really believe that the United States under Trump would give Ukraine Tomahawk missiles.
let us recall that American Tomahawk cruise missiles are capable of storing up to 15 pre-programmed targets in their memory, and they can change their target mid-flight as well as carry either nuclear or conventional warheads.
The latest report for Lukashenko, a meeting with Tikhanovskaya, Zelenskyy launches a plan to overthrow the dictator. Lukashenko's urgent time has run out. While Minsk tries to pretend that everything is under control, behind the scenes, a political death sentence has already been signed for the regime. Lukashenko is living out his last days in the president's chair. All the details. Watch.
Ukraine has set its sights on Belarus. For the first time in years of war, Kyiv is not just talking about a democratic Belarus, but is starting to speak with it directly. On January 25th in Vilnius, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy held a full-fledged meeting with Sviatlana Tikhanovskaya, the head of the United Transitional Cabinet of Belarus, effectively the government in exile.
This was a politically calculated move that was meant to be heard. We are with you, all those who want Belarus to be democratic, and this is what the regime in Minsk needed to hear.
For a long time, contacts with the democratic opposition of Belarus were effectively blocked. The office of the President of Ukraine operated on the simple logic of not touching Lukashenko so as not to provoke him into even more active participation in the war against Ukraine. It was believed that maintaining a cautious distance would at least preserve the illusion of Minsk's neutrality. But that illusion has crumbled. Belarus has become almost a full-fledged launchpad for the Russian invasion. Its territory is being used to station Russian troops and weaponry, and Lukashenko himself is becoming ever more deeply entangled in military and political dependence on the Kremlin.
For now, unfortunately, Lukashenko's white spitz has more rights than the people of Belarus. There was a chance to change this in 2020, and I am sure there will be another chance. But back then, there simply wasn't enough support for Belarusians. And now we all feel just how much harder, how much more costly it has become. How much more dangerous Belarus's dependence on Moscow has become for all of us.
But the Vilnius meeting is not only about reassessing the past, but also about planning for the future. Right now, Lukashenko has a real chance to break out of international isolation. In the West, there are increasingly frequent signals about the possible partial lifting of sanctions and Minsk's return to diplomatic formats, all under the guise of peace initiatives and regional stabilization. For Ukraine, such a scenario is dangerous. Legitimizing Lukashenko means preserving a Russian military foothold on the northern border and an attempt to freeze Belarus in the role of the Kremlin's vassal for years to come.
Operators of Russian Shahed drones are acting against Ukraine, including from Belarusian territory. The coordination for strikes is maintained from Belarusian territory. Russia is using Belarus as a testing ground to blackmail Europe and the world with hazel groves. Belarusian industry is working for Russia's war, and trade ties help Putin buy components needed to create threats against all of us in Europe.
That's why Kyiv is taking a preemptive step. According to media reports, Zelenskyy and Tikhanovskaya discussed specific mechanisms for deepening cooperation, from restoring a separate Belarusian direction in Ukrainian diplomacy to legal steps that could finally close the door for Lukashenko to any international rehabilitation. This includes the possible initiation of international criminal prosecution. For Ukraine, this is a way to eliminate the gray corridor of Russian influence at its borders.
I want to say something specifically to the people of Belarus. You are a European people who will stand together in unity with all our nations, in our free Europe, in a peaceful Europe, in a strong Europe, and you cannot be erased. And while the West hesitates, the Russians are increasingly absorbing the Belarusians. Just 40 kilometers from the border with Ukraine in the Gomel region, near the Yakimovka railway station, a new training ground is being built. The main construction work is scheduled for 2027 and 2028, with funding of $52.50 and $86 million, respectively. At the same time, construction continues on a military town near the village of Pribor in the Gomel district, where a new airborne assault brigade is planned to be stationed. The deployment of such a base is, after all, a direct threat to Ukraine. And this is a signal to us that we must also prepare for possible scenarios of an offensive from Russia through Belarus and possibly the involvement of Belarusians in this process.
It seems that for the first time in years, Belarusians have a real opportunity to break the chains of Putin's regime and regain their freedom. to step out of Moscow's shadow, determine their own future, and build a Belarus that will be part of a free and democratic Europe.
Europe throws down the gauntlet, a new military alliance with Ukraine instead of NATO, a shocking response to the ultimatum over Greenland. Urgent, Europe's patience has run out and the world stands on the brink of the greatest split in history. Watch for all the details of this sensational turn of events.
The political crisis surrounding the island of Greenland has made the EU reconsider its position about how to move forward without America's support. Donald Trump made it clear to the whole world that he is determined to take the island at any cost.
If we don't go in there, Russia and China will. Denmark won't be able to do anything about it, but we can do everything.
The US president's threat to impose tariffs on any country that tries to prevent him from seizing Greenland was the last straw for the EU's patience. This was reported by the American publication Politico.
But for many European governments, including America's oldest and most loyal allies, Trump's threat to impose punitive tariffs on anyone who tries to stop him from seizing Greenland was the last straw. They believe that now a breakup is inevitable. In frequent conversations, concerned European officials called Trump's hasty decision to annex sovereign Danish territory madness and delusion. Politics.
It seems that Europe is ready to create a new alliance to replace NATO. Without the US, but with Ukraine, Ukraine could play a crucial role in this defense union because of its size, geographic location, defense industry, and the fact that it is already at war and has invaluable experience.
Ukraine will be key to Europe's defense. Above all, because of its technological base, particularly its well-established production of top-class drones and the presence of the largest army in Europe. Huliaipolie, military analyst.
For example, the United Kingdom, France, the Scandinavian countries, the Baltics, Poland, Germany, and Italy. For most of Trump's second term, they worked within the framework of an effective group called Without America, the so-called Coalition of the Willing. And it could become the beginning of a defense alliance between Ukraine and Europe.
The Coalition of the Willing initially dealt with issues concerning Ukraine. It created very close ties between some key people in the capitals. They strengthened trust and the ability to cooperate. They know each other by name. It's easy for them to get in touch and send messages. If you factor in the military power of Ukraine, as well as the strength of France, Germany, Poland, and the United Kingdom, the potential armed force of the Coalition of the Willing would be enormous and would include both nuclear and non-nuclear states. Politics.
Right now, Europe is fully supplying Ukraine with weapons, and the US and Ukraine, in turn, has the largest combat-ready army in Europe. That's why a new military alliance without the US is entirely possible, considering that the threat from Russia will not disappear even after a possible peace agreement.
Ukraine has friends who understand the nature of Russian aggression as a shared problem. With them, we can try to create defensive alliances. On a tactical level, we can try to form regional unions. For example, the Baltic countries, Poland, others, a Central European state, and the United Kingdom. This will be a temporary and not very stable means of pursuing our strategic interests. But it is possible and necessary to look for other options for defense alliances. Anatoly Krugashov, political scientist.
The question of the EU's need for defense without US support has been discussed for a long time. In recent days, many initiatives and bold headlines have been coming out of Brussels, and a coalition of those willing to stand with Ukraine could be the beginning of a new defensive alliance. Officially, there is one. A decision has been made to ensure its own self-defense by 2030. But in wartime conditions, this decision could be made much earlier.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now. A fiery boomerang has struck Russia, setting the oil heart of the country ablaze. Oil depots and thermal power plants have been swept away by the strike. And this is only the beginning of the catastrophe. The Ukrainian armed forces' drones are turning Russia's rear into ashes. The retribution for the strikes on Ukraine came instantly and without mercy. Details to follow.
In Russia's Penza, thanks to the work of drones, the oil depot, so to speak, is leaving the chat. Later, local authorities confirmed the drone attack and reported a fire at the oil depot.
First, the oil depot in Penza, which, as far as I know, is not just an oil depot. It serves, let's say, a certain function as a strategic facility, in the sense that this oil depot is used both by the Russian army and accordingly by those who provide logistics for movement directly within the region itself, including a region that, once again, like all of Russia, is currently working for the front. Disruptions Such disruptions to this logistics will already lead to corresponding problems.
In addition, it is preliminarily known that the local thermal power plant was also targeted by the drone attack.
There is a nuance because, according to my information, something also hit the Penza thermal power plant. In other words, we are talking about the strikes that the defense forces continue to carry out against the energy infrastructure of the Russian Federation. Why do I consider these facilities to be military targets? First of all, this needs to be discussed, because this is a so-called switch, and if we turn it off, then shutting off such a switch affects the production and capacity of the military-industrial complex.
It was also reported that in the Voronezh region, as a result of Russian air defense operations, a residential building caught fire. When it comes to the operation of Russian air defense, it must be acknowledged it's already become routine. The Russian Ministry of Defense confirmed the operation of air defense in the Voronezh region, but did not mention the consequences of this operation. As for
the protection of such facilities, we know that Russian air defense systems are the first and very important factor. This is a threat to the local population, because we very often see how Russian air defense systems launch missiles and end up hitting their own homes.
Meanwhile, SBU drones struck the Tamaneftegas oil terminal in Russia's Krasnodar region. And Tamaneftegas is, it's important to note, not an ordinary facility.
We're talking about supplying the Black Sea Fleet. No matter how much it has been cut down by the defense forces today, unfortunately it still has missile carriers, particularly in Novorossiysk. And these ships accordingly need fuel. As a result, they may not be getting enough of that fuel. In other words, this means a reduction in the number of combat sorties, for example. This is the supply for Russian troops in the south, the southern group of forces. This directly affects the front line. That's why such strikes, plus the disruption of the production cycle, are significant. After all, it's not just about destroying a storage tank, which by itself is quite a sight when it's burning. It's about putting out of commission, among other things, unique equipment that Russia today cannot replace. They can't fix or resolve these problems in a timely manner. That is, this equipment requires time to install new units. I have serious doubts that the Russian Federation is currently prepared to make up for these losses, especially quickly after such strikes. And
such strikes have already become commonplace for Russia, which is clearly unable to cope with Ukrainian drone attacks, although of course there have been attempts.
Russia has started covering oil refineries with metal protective structures and nets.
But the so-called spiderweb nets did not become a panacea, and then
Russia began recruiting volunteers to guard oil refineries from drone attacks.
In short, while the Ukrainian armed forces are increasing the number of strikes and honing their accuracy and effectiveness, Russia is frantically trying to come up with a solution to counter Ukrainian drones, but so far, as we can see, without success. Because spiderweb nets, groups of volunteers, and air defense systems that target residential buildings can hardly be called effective means of fighting drones.
Hell on earth in Huliaipole, street carnage. The Ukrainian armed forces are burning out the occupiers block by block. The city has turned into a mass grave for Putin's elite. The deadly ring is tightening, there is no way out. All the details from the front line. Watch right now.
The gray zone in Huliaipole. The Russians are actively storming the positions of Ukrainian forces from the north, south, and west. However, they are unable to gain a foothold in the city itself.
This is a large gray zone. Mostly the enemy attacks our positions in the outskirts, on the northern, southern, and western approaches to Huliaipole.
In Huliaipole itself, fighting continues between outgoing groups and those conducting reconnaissance, search, and assault operations. The enemy faces roughly the same situation. They cannot bring in consolidation groups. The situation in Huliaipole remains one of the most difficult on the front line. Ukrainian forces are operating in all parts of the city, trying to cut off enemy logistics. The occupiers, despite heavy losses, continue active assault operations.
The main objective of the occupiers is to try to bypass Huliaipole along the flanks of the Ukrainian grouping. That's why the main actions are concentrated precisely on the flanks. This is an attempt to take direct control of the logistics of Ukraine's defense forces. In other words, they are using their now favored tactic of so-called small cauldrons. But I want to emphasize once again that the situation, despite the Russian side's claims of full control over Huliaipole, does not correspond to reality.
According to various estimates, the Russians are losing about 250 to 300 people daily in this direction, which is why the enemy has already changed the composition of the brigades and assault units twice. Huliaipole. The main tactic of the Russians is small groups. The enemy sends assault groups of 3 to 4 people advancing with electronic warfare support under the cover of drones and artillery.
At
the moment, the city is indeed almost entirely in the gray zone. But Ukrainian assault units are operating throughout the entire settlement. A similar infiltration tactic is also used by the Russian occupiers. Their tactic is to operate in small assault groups of 2 to 8 people. Despite extremely challenging and adverse meteorological conditions, and the strategic redeployment of both operational reserves and the overwhelming total air superiority maintained by the enemy forces in this specific direction, the Russian side's official claim of achieving full control over the settlement of Huliaipole is fundamentally inaccurate and does not correspond to the actual situation on the ground. Moreover, the occupying forces are currently unable to bring their so-called specialized consolidation and stabilization groups into the city limits. That is, after the assault troops, the actual units of the occupying forces are supposed to follow and secure positions on the front line, where they have managed to break through the defenses of the Ukrainian defense forces. However, in the Huliaipole direction, this is not the case. According to the Southern Defense Forces, there are about 25 combat engagements daily.
Fighting continues both on the outskirts and in the center. Combat clashes can last 45 to 50 minutes. In fact, there are 25 engagements per day. There is constant noise and gunfire. One group goes to storm, then another goes to storm. Drones and artillery are in action.
The Russians are not neglecting air attacks either. The enemy is using aviation and making extensive use of strike drones. In addition, according to the Southern Defense Forces, the occupiers are preparing thermobaric drone strikes on Ukrainian positions in the Huliaipole area.
According to our intelligence, in the Huliaipole direction. A few days ago, Russian unmanned aerial vehicle units received about 1,500 thermobaric hand grenades. These are intended to be dropped on our positions.
Zaporizhzhia region, particularly Huliaipole, is one of Russia's priorities after Donbass. Here, the enemy is trying to widen the front in order to disperse the Ukrainian armed forces and strengthen their position for upcoming negotiations.
the escalation of the situation in the Huliaipole direction is purely informational and political in nature. Let me explain what this is about. Lacking the ability to achieve tactical successes either in the Pokrovsk or Kupiansk directions, and moreover, having suffered both military and ideological defeats, let me remind you, there were statements at the highest representative level of the occupying country about taking full control of these settlements. The Russian occupiers are trying to compensate for these defeats with tactical advances in the Zaporizhzhia direction, which is secondary and not a strategic direction for them. Why do I say that for them? This primarily has informational and political significance. Huliaipole is the second largest settlement in the controlled territories of Zaporizhzhia Oblast. Accordingly, establishing control over it would allow the Russians to increase their leverage in the negotiation process.
As for Huliaipole itself, the Russians' goal here is not simply to occupy the settlement. The fact is that there are railway junctions nearby, and according to military political observer Alexander Kovalenko, if the Russians succeed in their plans, they will be able to create a springboard for a potential offensive. In Zaporizhzhia,
if the Russians succeed in their plans, they could potentially reach the territory of Pokrovskoye, Dnipropetrovsk region. Up to Huliaipole, they could create a foothold that would be supplied logistically for 80 combined arms armies. That's 250,000 to 300,000 people, which would be enough for a potential offensive in Zaporizhzhia. For context, there are currently 100,000 occupiers concentrated in the Huliaipole and Pokrovsk directions.
That's why Huliaipole is not just a point on the map, but a strategically important settlement that the armed forces of Ukraine continue to defend bravely, inflicting heavy losses on the occupiers.
Urgent! Russia's technological embarrassment, its Starlink analog, has failed. Moscow is frantically searching for a replacement for Elon Musk's technology so as not to depend on the West. But something didn't go according to plan. Why are the occupiers attaching satellites to drones? And why, in fact, doesn't Russia's satellite communication work? All the sensational details are in the report. In these frames,
we see the well-known Russian Molniya drone. But there's something unusual about this UAV. Starlink is mounted right on the body. At the beginning of December, the Russians started attaching satellite communication modems to their drones. Such drones are not affected by electronic warfare systems, but bypassing EW is far from the only reason for this upgrade of Russian UAVs.
They are looking for solutions that could enhance the capabilities of their strike assets. And it is specifically the Starlink terminals that provide this capability, because they guarantee a high-quality communication channel. Of course, there is some delay. Obviously, this significantly increases the cost of strike assets, but we understand that it is still much cheaper than using, for example, missiles like the KH-101 or Iskander.
The arsenal of drones that Russia is strengthening so much is expanding. These are already shots of the BM-35 drone to which a Starlink has been attached. Such a UAV has probably already reached as far as Dnipro and even Kiev. This Russian technology has also reached the Shaheds. Drones under manual control were flying almost at ground level so that they wouldn't be seen by radar. One of these Shaheds, according to radio technology specialist and advisor to the Ukrainian Minister of Defense, Serhiy Flesh-Bezkresny, struck helicopters. This method of so-called drone optimization is relatively new, but the Kremlin understands that Ukraine will soon find a way to counter such UAVs. But Russia is not going to abandon the idea of strengthening its strike capabilities with satellite communications. That's why they are working on creating their own domestic version of Starlink.
The enemy is looking for a solution to create its own communication system that will allow it to operate in the same mode. Therefore, these intentions represent a deliberate and strategic effort to replace the existing Starlink network with their own proprietary communication system. This transition would allow them to control and utilize the technology independently, ensuring it remains entirely free from any potential complications or technical hurdles, such as the heavy international sanctions or other complex issues that Russians currently face when they are in the process of purchasing or operating Starlink terminals.
But so far, the Russians have not managed to surpass or even catch up with Elon Musk. The launch of the Russian analog of Starlink has failed in Russia.
As people say around here, it would be funny if it weren't so sad.
According to Russian media, the launch of the first batch of low-orbit satellites for broadband internet access has been postponed indefinitely, as the authorities have failed to realize their ambitious plans.
According to two sources in the space market, the launch of the first 16 satellites has been postponed to 2026. This may be due to the fact that the required number of satellites has still not been assembled. For their part, Bureau 1440 stated that the company is carrying out work according to the planned schedule and promised to provide updates on the project's progress as it moves through each stage. Exact launch dates and other sensitive information are not subject to disclosure.
How the Kremlin plans to proceed with its goal of deploying 156 satellites in 2026 remains unclear.
We will give our response to Starlink with the Dawn Project Bureau 1440. Since
more than half a year has passed since work on the project began in May 2025, and out of the promised satellites, there are exactly 0 in orbit.
If they work very hard. In any case, they can successfully create some kind of comparable system. But let's remember that even in the Soviet Union there were problems, significant problems, specifically with satellite systems that could provide the capabilities, for example, that American satellites offer. Therefore, without a doubt, there are plenty of people eager to spend Russian money and, so to speak, present various projects which, even at the formation stage, can already be said to be unsuccessful. But this is packaged well and sold to the Kremlin leadership.
The aerospace company that took on the development of a Starlink analog, the work on creating Russian satellite communications, actually started earlier. In 2023 and 2024, Bureau 1440 began testing technologies. There were even experimental missions, as a result of which 6 devices were launched. But this is not what Putin expected.
the creation of powerful satellite constellations is intended to ensure high-quality navigation and communications, including satellite data transmission.
Right now, the focus is on the commercial aspect, scaling, and government funding. Putin allocated almost $1.5 billion for the domestic Starlink. And that's not surprising, because the bunker dictator really likes Elon Musk's invention, as well as Musk himself.
As for Elon Musk's private business, he is undoubtedly an outstanding person. That must be acknowledged. In
2025, the company planned to launch 150 to 180 satellites per year. By 2035, the constellation is supposed to include more than 900 satellites. Under the Kremlin's import substitution policy, this is not just an unrealistic goal, but, according to military political analyst Alexander Kovalenko, borders on schizoid absurdity.
At the time this statement was made, there was already a sense of farce surrounding the Dawn project. All the more so since Bureau 1440 launched the first 6 test satellites in 2023. These Dawn satellites provided data transfer speeds of up to 12 megabits per second with a latency of up to 41 milliseconds. But the nuance with these satellites is how they were assembled. They were made mostly from Western components, the supply of which is now closed to Russia due to sanctions.
it's possible that Russia may ask for help from its partners and use Iranian and Chinese technologies. But for that to happen, people in Russia would have to want their own Starlink more than they want to steal money. Let us explain. Back in 2018, the then head of Roscosmos, Dmitry Rogozin, had already promised Putin a Starlink made in Russia. But the ambitious Sfera project turned into an equally ambitious budget siphoning scheme. At that time, the project was estimated at $60 billion.
Space exploration should become much more significant, a factor in national development.
The new project, although cheaper, faces even more problems in its creation. But Putin is being promised yet another domestic innovation.
That's all for now. And for more hot news from the front, tune in to the next episode.